Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, everyone. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, and this is a podcast for the gospel of the upcoming Sunday, this Sunday being the Epiphany 6 Sunday. I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm Justin Crisp.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
And today we promise you sex, adultery, divorce, murder. This one has it all. This is Matthew 5:21-37. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The gospel of the Lord. Well, we said last week, hold on to your eyeballs. So here we are. There's so much in this. And where would you like to begin?
Read in one way, this is just not true. How's that for blunt? What I mean by that is read as a series of moral exhortations or commands or injunctions, duties given us by Jesus. It's just not true. For example, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It is not true that somebody who imagines committing adultery with somebody has just committed adultery with them. It's not actually true. To have a lustful impulse and not to act on it is actually a good thing. Another example, anger and murder. So Jesus is saying, "You shall not murder. Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment," etc. That's what his audience has heard. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. Just as the assumption is implied here, that just as whoever murders shall be liable to judgment, so also if you're just angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. That's not true either. If you're so mad with somebody that you could kill them, and then you don't go on to kill them, that's a good thing. You haven't committed an egregious moral evil. I'm not saying that it's a great thing to be incredibly lustful or to be incredibly angry, but these are not, morally, they are not on the same playing field as murder or marital infidelity. They're just not. Jesus seems to be equating impulses or emotions, or what the ancients would call passions, with acts which actually put those passions, emotions, impulses into play. And a lot of the moral life actually consists in not acting on many of our passions, right? I think that a great illustration of the ludicrousness of this text as a set of moral injunctions is in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, right? I mean, the plot of Macbeth gets going because Macbeth imagines committing a murder, considers committing a murder, is tempted to commit a murder, and then thinks that he's going to be liable to punishment for just being tempted to murder, and so he might as well just go through with it. Shakespeare knew it was ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous too. Now, I don't think this text is actually a set of moral exhortations. It's not actually that. But if read in that way, it's not only ridiculous, it's just straight up untrue. The question is, what is Jesus actually doing? That's my shot across the bow.
That's an excellent start. I think that was a good start.
Okay, let's hear what you have to
So
respond.
I think that was a great start, Justin. So I think that we have to see this in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, in the context of the gospel. So just to review, we started off chapters 5, 6, and 7, right? And we started off with the Beatitudes, and then we went to the teachings of salt and light, saying to the nobodies, they're salt and light. And then we went to the teachings of I didn't come to throw out the law, I came to fulfill the law and accomplish it. And now we're into really like stage 3 of that, which is this question of you have heard it said in days of old, but I say unto you, where he takes the law and what you're describing, Justin, instead of deeds, he's talking about desires and the stuff of the heart. In the eyeball, a lot to come. We'll come back to the eyeball a lot. Poor Elizabeth has had trouble with her eye, so we can have a long conversation about eyeballs here a little bit.
She knows a lot about eyeballs now.
I think that what's happening here, the context that is so easy to miss, is that it's perhaps something like this. Jesus is saying, okay, so you think I don't, you accuse me of breaking the law, of not being a person of the law. And so I will say to you, I am such a person of the law that I would say the law can be interpreted in this way. And so he takes the monumental thing, it is the thing, the law is the thing, and he takes upon himself the authority to say, now I'm going to comment on the thing. You say this, but I say this, and he doesn't quote other rabbis in the process. He has his own authority. But I think the deeper thing, Justin, to answer your question is for him to say, okay, so with reference to your relationship with God, if you think you're going to make it, you think you're good by the way you're doing your law, let me tell you, this is how the law really is. So now are you still good? And it's not possible for anybody to live into Jesus's law. It's not. This is simply not possible, right? And to be a human being. And so, but if you take that and you say, so Jesus is saying, righteousness is not in the law as you understand the law. That righteousness is going to be given to you by God through the actions of me. And so it's going to take all of this stuff. But if you want to play the legal game, you want to play the law game, I got you on this one. And I'll one-up you. So he both one-ups him and then removes it, all in a series of moves read in the context of the whole Sermon on the Mount and the whole gospel.
Ooh, that's a hot start. I think I can hear the comments already pouring in. But, it'd be nice, maybe we'd take just a moment to step back and consider Matthew again in Matthew's context, as I love to do. And the Sermon on the Mount is so powerful, taken start to finish. Here, we're just taking a little piece out of its context. And I see here a kind of a crescendo building of Jesus's rhetoric, and his, the way he's teaching has a certain build up to a higher point. And then our lectionary leaves off just the verse that he's getting to, I think. But, Jesus here throughout the Gospel of Matthew, which we've said already is written sort of like an answer to the Torah, Jesus's new interpretation of Torah. And so for Matthew's community, they're being instructed as a new community, following the way of Jesus. They're mainly from a Jewish background, and the gospel's written in this kind of like 5 major teaching blocks, the way the Torah is in 5 books. So, we already have the Matthean community understanding the Mosaic Torah, the way that they've grown up with and the way that Jews have traditionally interpreted their Torah. And then Jesus offering this messianic Torah interpretation. And, so throughout the gospel, he's saying, this antithetical way of speaking, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, only Matthew has that form when he's teaching, even though these teachings have parallels in Mark and Luke, they're not really set up this way. But it just seems like Jesus, the rabbi, the consummate teacher, is really claiming his authority to interpret anew this whole entire teaching of the law. So it's not like he's breaking with the law. He's doubling down and offering this new way of interpreting. And I think it's, we can't overstress how the love command undergirds all of what he's doing here. And the verse that we leave off in our lectionary is, you've heard that it, verse 38, we've just read up to verse 37, but verse 38 is, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that revenge right that people had to do tit for tat. But I say to you, overcome evil with good. And so if we included this verse, we might be able to say, oh, okay, see what he's doing with this. Because he's starting with an easy one. Everyone can get on board with it's wrong to murder. And they get increasingly more difficult because I think it's very cut and dry that obviously murder is the ultimate sin, to take another's human life. And here in that first one, he's talking about even anger, even unreconciliation is a form of murder because it separates you, and, it's a prison of its own. You'll be thrown into prison. It's almost like you'll never be able to thrive if you're at odds with one another. And so why bother coming to the altar until you reconcile? But they get increasingly more difficult because adultery, looking at a woman, it's really hard that we can split hairs with that one, and there's maybe some wiggle room about what adultery is or why it happens or, how bad is it if you just look. But I think it's really hard because it's less cut and dry, and then divorce was even more murky, and there were times that it was absolutely okay. And I think in the Jewish law, you could divorce your wife if she screwed up your dinner. But there wasn't a lot of room for women in that picture. So Jesus, you have to remember that in the Matthean community, women were invited in as equal sisters in the community. It was a whole different relationship than women were seductresses or they were just property, and adultery was like a form of theft. To steal another man's wife was to steal like the number one part of his property. But for Jesus, it was, you have to treat women like sisters, not like seductresses or property. So, there's a whole world of reinterpretation that Jesus is undertaking here. And I think it's all shot through with this love command. So, yeah. What else?
I'm with you. I'm with you on the love command bit. And I think that part of what's going on here, Jesus is going to clarify in a few verses where he says that God sends rain upon the just and the unjust, and then enjoins his followers to be perfect as their heavenly Father is perfect. And that's an incredible line. It's also an impossible one, right? It's if you read it as a moral injunction, the only thing that I can do is like give up, right? It just makes me want to like take off my clerical collar, put it through a shredder, and say, okay, I'm ready to go try something else. Somebody telling me be perfect, I don't have a lot of time for that. Somebody telling me to be as perfect as God. I don't have a lot of time for that either. I have even less time for that than moral teachers who walk around telling me to be perfect, because it's just impossible, and I can't live with that kind of incessant moral demand. It's a miserable way to live, to be holding yourself to perfection and never to be able to achieve it. But Jesus is, again, I don't think Jesus is morally enjoining his people to anything. I think that the whole text of the Sermon on the Mount only makes sense if it is heard from the other side of grace. If it's heard from the other side of mercy, if it's heard from a place where you're no longer worried about getting right with God, and you are concerned for a righteousness of an entirely different sort. If you read this as like, this is the blueprint for your life, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, it's just a massive cudgel with which to bludgeon your soul. But if you hear this from the other side of grace, if you hear this as God saying, look, you and I, we're okay here. We're all good. That's not what I'm not talking about how to get good with me. I'm talking about how to look more like me, so far as I'm going to make that possible for you by grace. Because I think that the love that is being talked about here, perhaps most clearly for me in the passage which immediately follows this one, where Jesus talks about going the extra mile, turning the other cheek, and then the really hard word on loving your enemies. That is a love which is supremely godlike. It is love, and it is unconditional love. I mean, Jesus is basically talking here. He's, to the extent he's enjoining anybody to do anything, he's enjoining people to a way of life that looks like the way of life of God. It looks like love spilling over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It looks like, to me, it reminds me of the way that many people talk about the life of the Trinity. In the creeds, the language that's used to describe the inner life of God is the language of procession. So we talk about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son. We talk about the Son being begotten by the Father, and so on. And these Trinitarian processions or relations are often imagined to be processions of, they're often imagined to be gifts of being out of love, or gifts of being which just are love, as the Father, the Son, and the Spirit give life to each other. And so that there is always a kind of, there's always the life of God internally consists in this self-giving love. And this is self-giving love in this world. This is what it would look like. It would look like somebody who was not angry to the point that their anger consumed them or the other person. It would look like a life which was in reconciliation with neighbor and friend. It would look like a life which was which did not demean or dehumanize or objectify the body of another person. It would look like a life that loved their enemies, that gave to whoever asked of them. He says that turned the other cheek, and so on. And that way of life, I think, is a way of life which is made possible for Christians. But I put it in the category of it is no longer I, but Christ who lives within me. Yeah, in that regard, it's because we that's Pauline language. It's because we have the Spirit of Christ dwelling within us and at work in us that we can live a life like that. It's not because God gives us a set of rules like this and then says, "Okay, go be perfect." It's not that kind of a strategy. It's very important for me that the Sermon on the Mount ends with people with the audience's response. It says that when Jesus had finished saying these things, this is at the end of chapter 7. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. And we've talked about authority in the past couple of podcasts, but the word amazed there is a form of the verb ekpleso, and it means to strike with panic, or to amaze, to astonish, to dumbfound, or to cause someone to be at a loss. So these people are in awe of this, actually. That's their response. It's the kind of like speechless and that speechlessness, I think, that speechlessness is the point rhetorically, and the speechlessness leads for me into the speechlessness of the mercy of God. When you're like, okay, I can't actually do this for myself. The best news is that I also realize it's already done for me, and it's going to be made possible for me by God. Anyway.
Wow. You just put an enormous amount of thought into what you just shared with us. I just, if I might pick up on one or two things here. One is the question of Jesus' authority, where you just ended. I just was on the phone with Russ Barksdale, known to some of you, and Russ did a lot of work on studying with rabbis about the rabbinical period of Jesus' time and how what the rabbis were saying about Jesus and the reverberations of that later in the Mishnah and the Talmuds, two of them. And one of those is to say that I'm completely with Russ and with many others, because Jesus was a rabbi. This guy was not a carpenter. He might have been probably great with wood and stone too, but he didn't, he was a rabbi. He didn't know this stuff because of without training. Secondly, rabbis began to be a full rabbi. You start in Jesus' day. You developed your full authority when you were 30. So when does Jesus begin his ministry? 29 and 30, right? So this is, and what we have here in my opinion, is something that is dumbfoundingly radical, that they're wowed by, and also not radical at all, because he's all in the law too. He says all about the law. So he's both. He's a hard guy to pin down, right? You guys think I'm not of the law, and he says I am of the law, and then he goes on and does what he does with it. And so Justin, I like much of what you said, but I was completely with you, and then I started to fade just a little bit on something, on one thing here, and I'm in agreement that we can't keep this law. I mean, the be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Is a form of either a nightmare, or it's, as you said, on something like on the other side of grace, it's a form of letting go-ness, because you can't. And then your beautiful quotation from Paul, not me, but Christ within me. It's a kind of form of giving up. It reminds me of athletes who in the big moment have to super relax. So if you're gonna, the reason I'm going to go out on a limb here. The reason that England missed the second penalty kick is he didn't relax. Okay, he just couldn't relax. And the reason the free throws go in at the key moment is because they relax. The reason a guy or a gal can make a putt to win a tournament is not because they're uptight, it's because they are unuptight. They relax. And so this kind of giving upness with the law, the giving up of the need for perfection, and letting grace or natural things flow. But that there is advice in this too. So if you don't mind me just taking a moment, and I've gotten a lot of this from others. So I've learned so much in the studying of this, and I got some of this from William Barclay. These are books I always rejected and then ended up loving. But he's talking about murder, and so if I might just rehash or rehearse his teaching. So thou shalt not murder, and Jesus takes it from murder, then he goes to anger, and then he goes to insult, and then he goes to you fool, and so the teachings here are that there's two types of anger, and one of the angers is quick, and it burns like fire on straw, burns up high, then dies down. And the second anger, which is the anger that Jesus is using here, is the type of anger that's long-lasting and is nursed, and you won't let it die. And so the first one is, Jesus is condemning selfish anger, anger that you keep because it feeds you, and you just keep it going because it burns, but it burns so sweet. Those are my words. And then the second thing, when the anger becomes an insult, and that's raka. And I've heard a lot of people speaking of raka, and they all say, the commentators all say that we don't really have a term for that, but it's the tone of contempt, and that you arrogant contempt for, and that's the insult. It's not just. It's a contemptuous insult, not just an insult. And then the you fool is moros, where you get moron from, where you attack somebody's moral character, and so you are murdering their reputation. So Jesus moves from murder physically to murder reputationally, and that you do it out of this contemptuous anger, And then, then back to Gehenna. Were we scheduling when they said I was eventually going to get to Gehenna? And I will get there, but very quickly. Gehenna, which we translate as hell, is that portion in the southwest of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's up in the valley, so there's all these valleys, and this is the valley where in the book of Chronicles we hear that they used to sacrifice children, so it became a cursed place, and then it became the garbage dump for the people of Jerusalem. So just to say, I think that there is wisdom teaching in there, whether or not they're law teaching in there, but it's wisdom teacher, which is to say, man, whatever you do, get rid of your, don't nurse your anger. Don't nurse your anger, and then don't just freak out and take it out on people, because this ain't good.
Well, there's beauty too in being reconciled. I mean, that's where Jesus goes with all that.
Right.
Don't just, let it go. I mean, do let it go, and then go repair. And I think that was the way of Jesus, was to reconcile and to be part of this being drawn back into one new humanity. He wasn't just cover your bases and make sure you're right with God. It was knit yourselves together into a community, and don't come to the altar all divided. And that was a big theme for Paul, of course, too, in Paul's letters to the early church. So here's Matthew kind of writing in that vein too, that come to terms quickly with your accuser, be reconciled to your brother and sister, and then come offer your gifts. That's, I think, really part of that same instruction that you're
Amen.
towards.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that breakdown. I hadn't really stopped to parse apart this.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
These levels of anger, and they resonate. It's not outdated at all, this whole
no,
passage, right?
Oh, I know that anger. Oh, I got that one too.
my
Yeah,
God.
I know. It's really helpful.
Ouch. Maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we get to adultery, that's such a moralistic, sex is the ultimate sort of moralistic thing that defines Christianity and defines different Christian traditions, is where you fall on who can have sex with whom and when and where.
That's an enormous statement.
But it is. If it's not...
Pretty true. It's very close to true.
It all comes down to money and sex. Yeah. It's just...
Keep going here, Elizabeth.
Am I right? I don't know. I just feel like this is
Definitely
where all the fault lines are, is who's in bed with whom and why. And so... this is a big one in our society and in our modern culture, even modern culture. But so is hell. So, there's this idea of hell that has been handed to us. And I think that most people who just brush with religion, or even many people who sit in pews in many churches, have this idea of hell as the place of the afterlife and the place where God is sending you if you do something wrong. And, that's like the big monolithic definition of hell for many, many people. Yeah. And as you've just started to say, Peter, when Jesus uses this term hell, he's talking about a geographical location outside of Jerusalem in real time, in real life. So he's not ladening it with this concept of an afterlife where God is going to send people, I don't think. If we want to take it that way, he's just saying, if you're going to nurse this anger, and if you're going to, divide from one another, and if you're going to commit adultery or lust after the women in our community, it's as good as like throwing yourself on the trash heap outside of Jerusalem, where we burn our trash. It stinks. It's gross. It's like a dark place. And predating Jesus' time, apparently, I guess if you go back to Jeremiah, I bet you probably all already know this, but it's in the Old Testament, Gehenna, or the place of, this location might have been a site of child sacrifice, right? So it has this whole entire history of a place of murder and a place of violence and death. So it's a visual for these people to see. It's not like a concept that modern Christianity has developed, not even just modern, but at least defaulted to, that hell is a place where God has for those who do wrong. And I think we all need a corrective on that, because Jesus is not saying that right here in this passage, if he's referring to this place outside of Jerusalem. So that's a big interpretive key.
You're also laying a lot on that. Justin,
No, please.
No, I mean, I think it is assuredly that place. Whether or not, I mean, I think by Jesus' day it does have echoes too, but I'm not a biblical scholar. I couldn't say.
Well,
exactly.
all I mean is it's not.
I couldn't say exactly what that.
No matter whether it's the place of child sacrifice in Jesus'
that
mind,
that is true,
or the place where they're burning trash, it's an actual place in that city.
Yes.
So it's not this concept for Jesus of an afterlife where people who have not reconciled or who have murdered will go because God is sending them there to burn. Silence.
I don't know enough. I don't know enough to say yay or nay to to that. I mean, I do think that the two of you, both of what the two of you are laying on the table here is useful. You're pointing out the fact that Jesus is here a wisdom teacher, and that there is genuine wisdom. So I'm with you there. Everything that you say here, Elizabeth, about lust, I think is true, and everything, Peter, which you were laying out with regard to anger, I think that's true. I do think that the rhetoric that he uses is the rhetoric has a different aim than simply to be a good communicator of wisdom. So far as wisdom
100%.
goes, I just have to say Aristotle's a better moral teacher than Jesus, to my mind. Okay, it doesn't mean that everybody needs to agree with me, but I am more convinced on the face of it as something which I'm like, okay, that jives with my moral intuitions, and that seems like a thing which I could mostly do, and that seems like a good program for my life. I'm more convinced by Aristotle's idea of the virtuous mean, right? That what you're going for is let's take pride, for example. Pride is a really good example. Aristotle would say that the right thing to do with regard to pride is neither to be too prideful nor not prideful enough, but to have what he calls proper pride, a kind of like good, whole sense of yourself as somebody who has, who is worth respect and so on, but not to be arrogant and also not to be so humble that one becomes self-deprecating and so on. Very different than, the way Jesus sometimes talks, not about pride straightforwardly, but about ways that we relate to ourselves. Such as, if anyone's going to be my disciple, I tell you, they have to take up their cross and to follow me, which some people, including Paul, I think, interprets that to be a subjective as well as an historical reality, so that the taking up of the cross is about what Paul calls being crucified with Christ. So it's a spiritual and moral as well as like an actual historical call to some kind of crucifixion or martyrdom and so on. I think that I'm not compelled by Jesus here because I think the way of life is so rational and wise. I'm compelled by it because it is shocking to me, and it is beautiful in its shock, particularly the bits about loving your enemies, giving to anyone who asks of you, turning the other cheek, the end of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I find that to be so unbelievably beautiful that I'm compelled by it. But I don't find it to be it's not the most convincing program for a life that I think is on offer in the world. I mean, a lot of people who live this way, they end up dead. Jesus did. I mean, this is what I talk about with the confirmation students, right? Jesus is actually going to say, this is what a way of life, which is in the image of God, looks like. And then you're going to see him live it. And you say, I love the trial scenes in the Gospels where, I think it's Mark in particular, where Jesus just doesn't give any answer at all to anybody. They're accusing him and all of that stuff. He doesn't even have a defense. He doesn't retaliate even in that moment. He doesn't even retaliate enough to answer the charges which are brought against him. He says things like, well, you say so. you say that I'm the king of the Jews, etc. But he doesn't actually ever give a defense. He is so in this mode of love on offer no matter what. Be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. I make my rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike. He is so in that mode. He doesn't even defend himself really. And he ends up dead, which I do find to be an extraordinarily beautiful thing, as I am compelled by it, and I am trying to live my life in this way, but not because I think it's the most wise thing that I've ever heard. Exactly. There is wisdom in it, but again, I think it's wisdom that's found on the other side of grace. It's wisdom that, if you're already compelled by Jesus, this way of life makes a kind of sense to you, or it would make sense to aspire towards this kind of life. I get really nervous anytime we get anywhere close to the idea that Jesus is somebody who's trying to reward the rewardable, to instruct the instructable, or to improve the improvable, which is I'm riffing on a quote from Robert Farrar Capon, the great theologian and chef and Episcopal priest. He was a parish priest on Long Island for a long time. I don't think that's what Jesus is about at all. Aristotle was trying to improve the improvable, and he was better at it. But Jesus' mission, as Robert Farrar Capon says, was not to improve the improvable, but to raise the dead. And for that, I am in, I'm dumbfounded. I'm with the people after the Sermon on the Mount. I'm just in shock. Anyway, so I suppose I'm trying to say I agree with you all, but I get just a little nervous whenever we inch towards self-improvement.
Yeah, I think I probably threw us into the last 20 minutes because I used the word wisdom when I was describing Jesus' teachings as he moved from murder into anger, into insult, into moros. It's because I wasn't quite sure what other word to use. I mean, maybe the better word would have been the new law, or I don't know, the Talmudic. There wasn't the Talmud yet. The Talmuds came later, but commentary on the law. And so I still don't know what word to use, but I super respect what you're saying. But I think that we are still. I think I'm in certainly agreement that this has to be seen in the light of like the Jesus glasses, in order to understand kind of what's coming at us. But that there's other stuff in here, and so on this question of, you've heard it said that you should not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust and has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You notice that this is male. There's no female here.
That's a good point.
And one of the issues certainly underlying all this is that women have no rights when it comes to, you touched on this, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to the law. And they have no rights when when we get to divorce. But I want to stick on this question of adultery and lust. And if your right eye causes you to sin, to tear it out. And here, again, this grew out of my studies. I didn't know a thing until I really spent a lot of time listening. And one of the guys I love to listen to is a guy named Chad Bird, and I suggest Chad Bird to everybody all the time. He's a Lutheran pastor who's a Hebrew scholar. And I heard him giving a talk about, should you cut your eyeballs out? And it was so good. And what he was saying was the whole thing about this eyeball thing, should you toss your eyeball out of your head, has its whole root in the Adam and Eve story in Genesis. And that it's in Genesis. The first time the word eye is used in the scriptures is from the serpent, and that they will have eyes to see good and evil. And he points out, they already see, right? And he told an incredible story about seeing good and evil, about a friend of his who was at a concert. And he had his 8-month-old baby in his arms, and a homeless woman came in, and his first thought was, gosh, I hope she doesn't come and ask me for money. And then he noted that his 8-month-old boy was waving at her, and eventually she turned and waved at him. And Chad was talking about this as they both have eyes that see, but one sees in a different way. And that the eyes that see, the word that it uses when Eve looks upon the apple is the word from which we get covet. So she doesn't just see the apple, she covets the apple. And here I got to have a shout out to my nephew, Johnny Sides, who when he was in first communion or confirmation class with the Catholic Church in Rye, he had to memorize the 10 Commandments, and he came home and he said to his mom, what is this that you shall not covet? Sorry, I can't even get the line out. I'll reboot that. you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. He didn't know what covet was, and it came out covet. My sister explained to him, that would be like if Dad liked Mrs. So-and-so, who was their next door neighbor, and he goes, well, that wouldn't be good. And so that's the covet. But anyway, the eye that causes us to sin is the eye that Eve begins to understand after she eats of the apple, which is she doesn't see the apple, she doesn't see the garden, she doesn't see all of creation as good, existentially good, and God made it, and it was good. So all this stuff exists for goodness. It just is good in its being, in its creation, but that it gets turned around that good is for the use of somebody else. And this is what happens. This was not Chad Bird, but I'll add this with the question of, and I'm looking at you because of your great care for creation, the word dominion in Genesis, and how do we understand dominion? Do we understand that we use this good to our own good? And that the right eye that looks, the coveting eye, wants to use for their own pleasure, their own good. It's to possess and to use. And so the question of should you knock your eyeball out or be as Origen and castrate yourself over all this stuff? And Justin, this is stuff that we've talked about. He goes on to say that most theologians are like White House press secretaries who say, well, I know the president said this, but what he really meant was that. And it's an incredible line. This is all Chad Bird, everybody.
Oh my gosh,
and
it's
so,
fantastic.
It is fantastic, and that's why I'm repeating it, because it's so good. And what he's saying is that's actually not the case at all. Jesus meant pluck your eye out or cut your right hand off. He said, if you want to play the game that you're going to be righteous by the law, well, then this is what it takes to be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. In other words, this game, if you think you're going to win this game, you're going to be knocking every body part you've got off, because it is impossible to win the game. And that's the point of it. So he says, well, Jesus actually did mean it. From that perspective, right from your first question, what was Jesus talking about here? What did he mean? And so you on the other, if you're looking at this without grace, this is your only option if you think you're going to be super holy before God, because it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. And you get into some things that you were saying, Elizabeth. I'm reminded of the yogi that always teaches me, and she's talking about moving your body, but she always says, what is resisted persists. If you resist, it will persist. And so all the history of I'll leave this at men, I won't speak for women, who have tried to resist these lustful thoughts, find that it persists all the more. St. Anthony in the Desert, if you want to read a really great 25 or 35 years of a guy who was trying by himself in the desert to resist, and it didn't work. And so that what we have here is a Hebrew scripture story coming out here in which Jesus is saying, if this is your game, this is what it would take.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Don't make this
incredible.
your game.
It's very powerful.
Yeah, Chad Bird. Who's Chad Bird?
He's a Lutheran pastor who's a Hebrew scholar who studied with rabbis, and I find him endlessly. I mean, he could read the phone book. I'd be like, no, that's it. Really, look at the way he said that name.
Totally.
Well, I like your words about the eye and that image, and it's reminding me of a quote by Rabbi Harold Kushner that said, religion is not primarily a set of rituals or a series of beliefs. Religion is first and foremost a way of seeing. And for me, the wisdom of Jesus is different than, say, the wisdom of Aristotle or other wisdom teachers, in that, or many wisdom teachers are like Jesus too, but it's teaching people how to see differently and to see with the eye of the heart, that kind of language, and not through the eyes of others, or it's a different kind of wisdom. He's a wisdom teacher of transformation, and I don't know. I would like to, stake claim to that word and not give up too quickly on Jesus as a wisdom teacher, because I do think he was very concerned about how we live in this life. With one another and with God. And so it doesn't, Jesus is very concerned about the whole of our lives and all of our relationships. And I think that it's not any one teaching he gives, it's the whole body of his teaching, where he was always, forming community and throughout Matthew, he returns to that reminder of Micah that, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He was constantly trying to get people to see God in a new light. And it is shocking and new. It was shocking and new for these early followers, and shocking that he would even have the audacity to claim that kind of authority for himself, to reinterpret the teaching of the Torah.
Agree. We should not lose that.
No, and he was a observant, practicing Jew, so he never really broke with the law, but he broke the laws that people had interpreted in a certain way. But the companion reading for this Sunday is from Deuteronomy, that where Moses, God says to Moses, I set before you life and prosperity, or death and adversity. Choose life that you may live. And when Jesus is healing on the Sabbath and things like that, he would probably say to the Pharisee or whoever's accusing him of breaking the Sabbath, I have before us life and death. This man can neither live or die. Shall I choose life or should I choose death? I think that he's got that bigger picture in mind, and that's the wisdom of Jesus, is that he can get behind all the letters of our law and all the checklists that we are so concerned about keeping, and transform the whole of our consciousness and the way that we see. So I don't know, there's so much power, but it is hard for us to read these words and really get the wisdom right off the page. I think it takes conversations like this to help us.
Can we not leave without touching divorce? Rob's trying to get us to be quiet.
Oh, okay.
Can we? I just feel like we have to talk about divorce.
Pastorally, yes.
This would be irresponsible for us not to talk about divorce, because this is.
Do you or don't you?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
Go for it.
I'll just start in then. I will just say that pastorally, the question of divorce is a monumental issue facing our churches. There's a great book written about divorce by Stephen Post, and the ramifications of such a thing and the complications of such a thing. Just to talk a little bit about divorce in Jesus' day, because Jesus, you're always wanting us to be in the context of Jesus' day, in the context of Matthew's people, but in the context of Jesus' day, you touched upon it earlier. The scriptures are very clear that marriage is sacred and you should not divorce. But that's in I think is that in Deuteronomy, but out of that grows the rabbinic tradition, in which there's many commentaries on such, and that the most conservative rabbinic tradition in Jesus' day was right where Jesus was. The only grounds for divorce are unchastity and adultery, and then you've already referred to Jesus with the stoning. I mean, you would be stoned to death for such a thing, right? And Jesus' response when he says, be the first one, those guys gathering with the rocks, those of you without sin, be the first one to chuck that rock. But on the other end of it, this was Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, and you referred to that, if your wife, spices the food the wrong way, or even if you find somebody more desirable, it's okay to write a certificate of divorce, which was essentially about 3 sentences. And so we talk a lot in our world, or hears about a lot of the, marriage is the loss of the family, all these things, marriage going down the tubes. Well, I mean, the family was in major crisis during Jesus' day, major crisis, both from the Hebrew tradition and the way the Romans were handling marriage too. I mean, it was throughout multicultural questions, and Jesus is speaking into that and sound, to try to maintain some of the sacredness of marriage. That's my take on it, at least.
Yeah. The only thing that I would add to that historically is I think that one of the things Jesus is intervening in here is it's not even to add, it's to underline a lot of what you said, Peter. Jesus is intervening in a patriarchal context, which is churning up, which is making women in particular incredibly vulnerable.
100%.
If you notice the pronouns, the gender of the pronouns used here for who does the divorcing and who is divorced, it's always the man divorcing the woman. I don't have this text right in front of me. It's not in my notes, but I believe that in one of the versions of this divorce saying in the other Gospels, Jesus suggests that a woman could divorce her husband, and that's incredibly radical. The female pronoun precedes the verb, is the subject of the verb rather than just the male pronoun, which was completely unheard of. No rabbi, to my knowledge, was teaching that. It is neither Hillel's teaching nor Shammai, to name the two poles that you've named there. And so I think that whenever Jesus tightens up the divorce code, part of the when he chooses that more conservative interpretation, which he's doing here in Matthew, part of what he is doing is he's tightening up this law, just like he's tightening up the rest of the law, and we've spoken a lot about what that means in the spiritual and the theological ramifications thereof. Part of it is that, but then also I think he's trying to keep women from being thrown out into homelessness or worse because they burned dinner. And that was a real possibility, and that was this is an actual problem in Jesus' day. So I think it's him trying to decrease the economic vulnerability of women in a system which was stacked against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with both of you, and I think it would be anachronistic of us to lay our concepts of marriage and divorce on this text, because all of it was different. Marriage was arranged. It wasn't really for love. It was totally different. It was, property transfer. So I think that that's important to flag. And since we've gone on so long, maybe we'll flag this for a future discussion, because it comes up again in Matthew 9. So we can stay tuned for that. But anyway, thank you all for joining us today. This has been a very incredible rich discussion, and now I have to preach on it.
What are you going to pick? What lane are you going to pick? Oh, gosh.
Make comments. Request a sermon. No. But thank you, and thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you in church. God bless you.